Hello, just want to give you a overview of the complex stuff that we're doing now in terms of verbs, and especially as we look now at what's called the second aorist forms. You're now realizing the importance of knowing the verbal stem, because the verbal stem is the key to recognizing a second aorist form. We'll be very shortly dealing with what's called a first aorist, but the second aorist form is really simple in the sense of remembering two things. The first is that it functions according to the verbal stem, not the present stem of the verb. And the second thing is that it takes the endings of the imperfect. Now, you already know the endings of the imperfect, and you'll know, therefore, when you come across a verb, like, for example, ballo, that's the stem in the imperfect is the same as the stem in the present, then you know that it's the imperfect tense. And especially when you see the augment at the beginning. So the ending, the three, as you look at then, say, for example, a ballon, you'd see the augment, which would tell you it's a past tense. You would look at the stem and you would see that the present stem is the same here as the verbal stem in the past, so therefore it must be imperfect. And then you'd look at the ending, on, which would tell you then what number it is. In other words, then it's either first or third person plural. Now, with the verbal stem, of course, if you see something different, as in this case, instead of two lambas, one lamba, and bal, so it's a ballon, then this is a second aorist form. So it's not going to be translated then as the sense of the continual action in the past as the imperfect, but it's going to be translated in the sense of something that's happened. I like what Mount says at the end of the chapter in respect to recognizing the different ways that the aorist is translated. At this point, just think of it as an action that's occurred, and therefore you really work it out from the context, or from, well, actually the context. I was thinking sometimes the writer will actually explain a bit more, which will show you how the verb is to be understood and is to be translated. But at this point, I want to keep it really simple. In other words, that there are second aorist forms, and these forms take the endings of the imperfect, but they're not the imperfect, because the imperfect ending is the same as the present stem. So therefore, it's wise to know, and they're not that many, the difference between then what you might call the present stem and the verbal stem. For many of the verbs that we've looked at, the present stem and the verbal stem are exactly the same, so it's not a problem. It's then just a question of just looking and seeing the different, what I call the codes that are put on the verb to help us define it, whether it's a past with an epsilon, augment, and so on, and then, of course, the ending of the verb itself. Now, having said that, there are a few verbs that have I'll use the term principal parts because you're being introduced to that now. Aorist form is a principal part. A future form is a principal part. Present form is a principal part. So you actually go through 6 forms and you know all those forms at this point. The key to you at this point, I think, is to learn off as you go along in respect to the verbal stem and the present stem, because there are certain verbs that we come across time and time again that are very important. And I'm just going to basically list a few of them that we come across. Ago, I lead, and then you look at the second aorist form, egagon, hamartano, I sin, hamarton, apothnesko, I die, apithanon, ballo, I throw, I've made a reference to that, eballon, heurisco, I find, huron, echo, and eskon, I have. There's a second aorist form. That's very, very common. Catalepo, catalipon, I leave. Lambano, elabon, I take. Manthano, emathon, I learn. Pasco, epathon, I suffer. Pino, epion, I drink. Pipto, epeson, I fall. Fugo, efugon, or efogon, I flee. These are verbs that you come across quite frequently, and what you really need to know again is just the element of the difference between the present stem and the verbal stem. Now, there are some forms that you just have to learn because they're irregular. Now, you can take little bits of hints that Mounds gives us in terms of the origin of how a verbal form developed. I find it better at this point just simply to say to myself, I just have to know that there are different forms for verbs. That some are completely irregular. Fortunately, they're not that many, and fortunately, we come across them quite often. So therefore, for example, erkomai, I come, which is a deponent verb, which is looks like it's past in meaning, but it's actually a present in meaning. And its stem is elth, so the present is actually formed from a different stem. And at this point, rather than go into where the origin of the stem is, I just basically learn it off. Erkomai is I come. Elthon with the stem elth is the second aorist form. Esthio, I eat. Ephagon is the second aorist form. The very common lego, I say, but the second aorist form is formed from epsilon pi, so it's ipon, I said, or in that case, I said. Orao, I see. Adon is the second aorist form, and pharaoh, I carry. Enenkon is the second aorist form in respect to that. So at this point, when you come across them, I would put a lot of time in actually writing out these irregular forms, especially, and just telling yourself over and over again, and usually, not always the case, but I find frequently the verbal stem is very short. And so therefore, when I see a very short verbal stem with the augment on it and then with the imperfect end in, immediately, because I've done it so often, that I know that this is a second aorist form. So I'm saying that to you to encourage you not to feel swamped by it in respect to the multiplicity of verbs that you'll come across that seem at this point to be really strange. Stick with the basic thing. The present stem and the present and the imperfect stem are exactly the same, and take the endings. Then what you know about the endings of the imperfect, then when it comes to an aorist form that's a second aorist form, you're going to get the augment, which will tell you it's a past tense, and the ending in itself will be imperfect, but the stem will be different from the present tense. That's going to tell you it's a second aorist form. At this point, ratify that in your mind as you go forward for the rest of the week.